Hey heroes, and welcome to another mighty episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. There have been many attempts at creating super soldiers in the Marvel Universe over the decades, most of which can trace their origins back to Operation Rebirth, the government initiative that transformed scrawny Steve Rogers into the heroic Captain America in 1941. The man responsible for this physical enhancement, Dr. Abraham Erskine, otherwise known by the code name Professor Reinstein, was assassinated by a Nazi spy, and having never committed the entirety of his formula to paper, the secret of his success seemingly died with him. Captain America went on to be a vital asset in the fight against Axis forces during World War II, but he and his partner, Bucky Barnes, disappeared during a conflict with the notorious Baron Zemo in 1945. Those inspired by Erskine's success included a scientist named Truett Hudson, better known by the alias Professor Thornton. In the closing days of the war, Thornton came upon equipment and research that had been abandoned by Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister, a notorious English scientist who allied with the Nazis and worked alongside them at Auschwitz. Using Sinister's research as a basis, Thornton was instrumental in founding the Weapon Plus program, a clandestine multinational organization with ties to both the CIA and the Canadian government. The Weapon Plus program subsequently spawned a number of independent projects, with each one denoted by a Roman numeral and Captain America retroactively referred to as Weapon 1. Of course, it will be years before many of these varied programs bore fruit, as most were passed over or otherwise delayed for decades. But in the meantime, the US and Canada forged a joint operation to pursue a method of not only recreating Erskine's original formula, but improving upon it. Dubbed Project Sentry, this operation was based in a secret installation in West Virginia, or possibly Western Pennsylvania, referred to simply as the Facility. In addition to American and Canadian researchers, former Nazi scientists were also brought into the project as part of the United States Operation Paperclip. Suffice it to say, those they chose to recruit were ones with experience and knowledge of human testing and experimentation. Furthermore, while Project Sentry was not part of Weapon Plus, it was aided by an early incarnation of the Weapon X program, which at the time was a secret Canadian bio-research initiative. These scientists contributed advanced information on genetic coding and specialized equipment. As for the Americans, they provided not only a facility in which to work, but research that they had compiled while attempting to recreate their original super soldier serum. Over the following years, the scientists at Project Sentry worked together with the goal of creating a formula that was several orders of magnitude more potent than Erskine's. However, as the decades passed and the state of the world shifted, Project Sentry lost its original form amidst the Cold War politics, becoming overly compartmentalized so that no one person was aware of its full scope. This also meant that nobody was at the helm to steer the entirety of the operation. As a result, the project splintered into subgroups, and with oversight becoming increasingly lax, some research work was outsourced to civilian scientists who were unaware of their work's potential applications. Now, for the next part of our tale, we will turn our attention to a boy named Robert Reynolds, or Bob as he would later be known. As a child, Robert was creative and loved to draw his own comic book characters, but he also suffered from a number of mental health issues, including paranoid schizophrenia, agoraphobia, and generalized anxiety disorder. Early in his teenage years, he experimented with drugs and alcohol, and while he initially hid his symptoms well, he soon began to struggle with substance abuse. Seeking more intense highs, he befriended an older student with similar vices named Howard Bliss. This is where our stories converge, because while Bliss enjoyed drugs and alcohol recreationally, he was also an assistant for a professor that had been subcontracted by Project Sentry. And so one day, Bliss left the door to the professor's research lab unlocked, and young Robert took his opportunity to steal a dose of an experimental super soldier serum. Unaware of what he had and unconcerned with the danger, the troubled youth took the vial of serum to the fairground and drank it behind a stall where he sometimes worked. The untested formula changed Robert on a molecular level, endowing him with an amount of power that has been likened to that of 1,000,000 exploding suns. At the same time, a deeply malevolent persona manifested within Robert, one that would eventually become known as the Void. Now, it seems to be the case that the Void was created at this moment, a dark alter ego that emerged as a result of Robert's psychiatric problems and newfound power. However, some have theorized that it was actually a much older entity, possibly even a biblical angel of death, and that by ingesting the serum, Bob Reynolds had somehow opened himself up to it, causing the two to become one. The veracity of that claim aside, Robert almost immediately manifested a separate, heroic persona to balance the Void's darkness, although Bob was not consciously aware of his dark side's existence. The first real confrontation between the two allegedly occurred when the Void manifested as a separate physical entity based on a character that Bob had created as a child, the Blue Buffoon. The details of Robert's earliest superpowered exploits are fairly muddled, as Bob himself had difficulty remembering the truth of his origins, eventually recalling snippets of an idealized version in which an innocent freshman at Midtown High naively ingested a secret formula developed by an unnamed professor for unstated reasons. In his mind, he used his newfound powers to defend his classmate, Lindy Lee, from a high school bully identified only as Buzz, and began to earn her affection. Of course, the fact that Bob and Lindy did later begin dating suggests that there is likely an element of truth in that memory. I will note that Lindy herself once presented an alternate telling of Robert's acquisition of the professor's secret formula that is similar in that it portrays Robert as a junkie that broke into a science lab looking for drugs, but contains some details which contradict earlier accounts, such as Bob having an accomplice break in with him. According to Lindy's recollection, rather than take the serum with him, Bob drank the contents of the mysterious vial on the spot, immediately causing an explosion of energy that destroyed the entire building when his powers manifested. The professor investigated the ruins of his lab and found Robert there, transformed but uninjured. And having gotten a taste of power, Bob Reynolds demanded more. Whether it happened this way or not, government officials involved with Project Sentry took notice of Robert, and he ultimately wound up being brought back to the facility. They began testing his abilities and found that his body absorbed solar radiation to fuel itself, granting him incredible levels of strength, speed, durability, and intelligence, along with enhanced senses and energy projection abilities. Furthermore, he seemed to possess untapped potential that was virtually limitless, held back only by his own mental state. This included dormant psionic abilities, and even the possibility of sharing his power with others. Terrified by the implications of the serum's unauthorized use and the unprecedented effect it had on a troubled teenager, some scientists at the facility tried to kill Robert as many as 9 times, but he was so impervious to damage that he apparently failed to even notice these attempts. The professor, meanwhile, was also transferred to the facility and purported to give Robert regular doses of his serum, claiming that he needed them to maintain his powers. In truth, however, these shots were harmless saline injections, and Robert's dependency on them was purely psychosomatic. While the professor succeeded in causing Robert to unconsciously limit his own abilities, the project staff at the facility were unable to stop him from coming and going as he pleased, and Bob began operating under the golden guise of the Sentry. His earliest exploits largely flew under the radar of the general public, but then came the dawn of the Marvel Age as more and more other heroes appeared. As the Sentry, he began operating out of a high-tech fortress called the Watchtower, which he designed with help from Reed Richards. This headquarters was run by an artificial intelligence of his own design, the Centrally Located Organic Computer, or clock. Sometimes troubled by the burden of his own power, Robert began speaking to a psychiatrist named Cornelius Worth, and while the doctor took his responsibility in the situation seriously, his treatments evidently awakened the dormant alter ego within Reynolds. As a result, Bob's dark persona began manifesting physically once again, and the Void became a costumed supervillain appropriate for the era. In one incident, the Void clashed with the mighty Avengers, but of course the Sentry wasn't far behind, and he ultimately befriended them and many other heroes. Teenage crime fighters like Spider-Man and the X-Men looked up to the Sentry, regarding him as a role model, and Bob's solar powers were even capable of calming the savage Hulk. He forged close friendships with Doctor Strange and the aforementioned Reed Richards, and revealed his secret identity to the Fantastic Four. By this point, he was in a committed relationship with Lindy Lee, who enjoyed the glamour of his superhero lifestyle. The two eventually married, and their wedding was attended by a number of the Sentry's allies. At some point, Robert also discovered his ability to share his power with others, which he apparently did with his canine companion, a Welsh corgi named Normie, who became better known as Watchdog. He was also assisted by a young man named Billy Turner, who received a portion of his power to become his sidekick, Scout. Throughout his career, the Sentry and his allies faced various foes, including the android pirates of Dimension 9, Cranio, a three-brained supervillain known as the Man with the Tri-Level Mind, Danny Boy, a shamrock-clad bruiser who the Sentry and the Hulk fought in the Negative Zone, the Hippie, who employed hallucinogenic substances and apparently once forced the Sentry to drink an entire lake filled with LSD, the Lobster People, irradiated mutants who hated mankind after being driven underground, but came to respect the Sentry after he and the Hulk saved them from the unintended side effects of their own weapon, Tommy Vermillion, aka The Vendor, a murderous android who made hot dogs out of human flesh, Xeniac, a monstrous member of a group called the Factious Five, and many others. For much of this, the Sentry maintained a secret identity as Bob Reynolds, but he eventually decided to unmask himself for the world at large, and had Spider-Man, in his civilian identity as photojournalist Peter Parker, break the news with a picture that soon became famous across the country. Throughout all of this, the Sentry's most infamous enemy was his own dark persona, the Void, who continued to manifest and grew increasingly dangerous. While initially operating as a criminal madman who sometimes allied himself with other villains, over the years the Void claimed thousands of victims in New York, and on one occasion even decimated an alien civilization. From the ruins of the Temporalon homeworld, the Sentry retrieved a single working relic, a device called a confluctor. It was also during a clash with the Void that Scout's career as the Sentry's sidekick came to an end, when the dark villain cleaved off his left arm. Throughout these exploits, the Void operated out of a headquarters that served as a dark reflection of the Sentry's watchtower. Rather than proudly standing over the cityscape, the Void's hidey hole extended deep beneath a frozen wasteland. He even had an artificial intelligence to mirror the Sentry's clock, known as the Computer to Obliterate Life Completely, or COLC. And eventually, amid their many battles, Bob finally realized the dark truth that the Void was actually an aspect of his own personality. However, it was not the Void who brought the Sentry's heroic career to an abrupt end, but another of his most persistent foes, an enigmatic military genius known only as the General. As mentioned earlier, it seems to be the case that the only limit to the Sentry's potential powers were those imposed by his own mind. To take advantage of this fact, the General employed Jason Wingard, better known as Mastermind, a mutant with the power to induce mental illusions, making individuals see and feel whatever he wanted. Using this power, Mastermind presumably constructed an illusory scenario in which the only way for the Sentry to defeat the Void was to force the world to forget that either of them ever existed. While Robert believed that Mr. Fantastic used clock to accomplish this, he actually did so himself by accessing his dormant psionic abilities. As a result, any and all evidence of the hero's exploits and dual identity simply ceased to exist. Magazines, news articles, and even the Watchtower itself vanished with no person on Earth remembering it was ever there. In the wake of this, Bob retired to an ordinary existence with Lindy and their dog Normie, while the Sentry and Void personas retreated into the depths of his subconscious. However, that was not truly the end for either of them. As Bob grew increasingly unsatisfied with an ordinary life for reasons that he didn't initially understand, he unconsciously transmitted vague recollections of his superhero career to a writer named Paul Jenkins, inspiring him to write a series of fictionalized comic books based on the Sentry's adventures. Furthermore, Bob's own memories were suppressed but not completely wiped away, and over time they gradually resurfaced. Things eventually reached a tipping point when the Void persona reawakened and separated from Bob, allowing him to become the Sentry once again. This was largely kicked off when he drank what he purported to be a dose of the Professor's super serum, but was identified by Lindsay as a hidden bottle of alcohol. I will note that this is from the book that initially introduced the Sentry, the first issue of which played with the notion that Robert may never have actually been a superhero and simply suffered from delusions. For example, when he opened his closet to retrieve his Sentry suit, what was really there was simply a jacket with a blue cape affixed to the back with clothespins. The end of the issue nonetheless depicts Robert taking to the sky, and so our story continues from there. Traveling to New York, the Sentry began reuniting with his old allies, starting with Reed Richards, causing their memories of him to slowly return as well. He spoke to heroes like the Hulk, Spider-Man, and the X-Men, and as he did, his physical transformation into the Sentry became more complete, costume and all. He reunited with his old sidekick, Scout, and the Watchtower even reappeared in New York as the world began to remember. Bob and his allies eventually united to confront the Void, who had tapped into even more of the Sentry's limitless potential to become a threat of cosmic proportions. In the end, however, Robert realized that the only way to truly stop the Void was to trap him within himself once again. As such, he reinstated the world's collective memory loss, re-merging with the Void and once again returning to his mundane existence as Robert Reynolds. However, this incident would prove to be little more than a prologue for the Sentry's true return, as the Void would not be contained forever. Eventually, both personas bubbled to the surface once more, and the Void even tricked the Sentry into believing that he had murdered his own wife. Because of this, Robert, having physically transformed into the Sentry once again, turned himself over to S.H.I.E.L.D. and was imprisoned in the raft. This caused Mr. Fantastic's memories to briefly resurface as well, and he sent defense attorneys Nelson and Murdoch to meet with Bob, only to immediately forget that he'd done so when his knowledge of the Sentry faded. But it just so happens that while they were there, the supervillain Electro launched an attack on the prison and instigated a mass breakout. In the midst of the confusion, Nelson and others were attacked by the notorious serial killer known as Carnage. However, the Sentry intervened and handed the symbiotic psychopath a crushing defeat, pulling him into space and ripping him in two. Bob then joined the other heroes and helped quell the rioting, after which he fled and hid in a cave in Arizona. With their memories of him still missing, Iron Man and the other heroes launched an investigation of the Sentry, leading them to clues that left them with more questions than answers. Notably, they spoke to both Lindy Reynolds, who despite Bob's claims was still alive and well, and Paul Jenkins, who fully believed that the Sentry was a character that he'd invented out of whole cloth. Iron Man tracked down and confronted the enigmatic Superman with Paul and Lindy in tow in an attempt to get him to fill in the blanks, but the Sentry retreated back into his civilian identity of Bob Reynolds and teleported back to his suburban home. An assemblage of heroes made up of Avengers, X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and Inhumans followed him there. However, the Void manifested as a series of monstrous forms that attacked the heroes in a mad rage. To get to the bottom of this, the psychic mutant Emma Frost entered Bob's mind and helped him uncover the truth of what Mastermind and the General had done. Panicked and mentally unstable, Bob attempted to flee from this by retreating within himself, but Emma then brought Lindy into his subconscious and had her share a meaningful memory, causing them both to recall the night that they fell in love. Calming down and gaining full control of himself, Robert transformed back into the Sentry and reabsorbed the Void. This time he chose not to reawaken the general public's memory of his previous exploits and instead was introduced to the world as a new member of the Avengers. Resuming his superhero career, he and Lindy moved into a restored Watchtower and even built a robotic duplicate of his old canine companion, Watchdog. He also resumed regular sessions with his trusted psychiatrist, Cornelius Worth. During this time, he attempted to keep the Void at bay by tricking himself, and by extension the Void, into believing that the malevolent presence had been securely locked away within the Watchtower, unable to escape. However, during a subsequent adventure in which the Sentry and the Hulk pursued the General and his men into the Negative Zone, the Void manifested there and attacked, killing the other villains himself. Dr. Worth also learned that the Void's imprisonment was a lie when Clock brought him to the vault where he was supposedly kept, and found nothing there but a chair and a mirror. After returning to Earth, the Sentry battled the Void again, this time at an amusement park that was devastated in the clash. Dr. Worth confronted Bob there, and the Sentry ultimately deduced that the Void was, for all intents and purposes, Robert's true persona, whereas his more heroic self was subconsciously created to protect the world from the Void. Of course, with an abundance of conflicting information and dubious presumptions, I'd say the true nature of the Sentry and the Void personas is somewhat open to interpretation, so you can let me know what you all think in the comments. In any event, when the Sentry tried to learn more about his origins by returning to the facility in West Virginia, Dr. Strange joined forces with S.H.I.E.L.D. and the professor who created the Sentry serum in the first place, and attempted to trap Robert in a false reality where he was an inpatient at a psychiatric hospital named John Victor Williams. However, he quickly found inconsistencies in that world which indicated that it wasn't real, and successfully broke free. Desperate to stop Robert, Nick Fury activated a thermonuclear device he'd planted in the professor's body, but the Sentry flew the doomed old man into the upper atmosphere and escaped before it exploded. In the wake of this, the Sentry tracked the Void to his hidden headquarters in the Antarctic and learned why Strange and Fury had gone through such extremes to try and stop him. Apparently, they were terrified that the Sentry serum in his blood could be used on others, creating more and more Sentries and Voids. In the end, the Sentry defeated his darker half and threw him into the sun, but as with every time he was beaten, the Void declared that he would return. After that victory, the Sentry returned to the Watchtower and reunited with his wife and allies, determined to stay vigilant for when his darker half eventually emerged once more. But that story will have to wait for another day. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel. And of course, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, then you can let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!